Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the Illinois State Water Survey, and today this is a webinar for the private well class entitled "Is My Water Safe to Drink? Common Questions About Private Wells." So today we will be going through a set presentation and answering a lot of the questions that were asked when you registered, and at the end there'll be time if some questions come up, or if your question doesn't get answered and you want to repeat it in the question box on the GoToWebinar screen, feel free to do so. So a little bit about this program. So the private well class is part of a national program through RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, funded by US EPA to support private well owners. And so this webinar follows the class that we've developed, which is what started this program nearly 5 years ago. And if you're not familiar with our class, it's a 10-lesson online class I'll talk a little bit about at the end. But you should be aware of that, especially for the well owners you serve if you're not a well owner yourself, but are a professional who works with well owners. And we do record all these webinars, and I've already had several questions from folks who couldn't be here today after they registered. And if you go to privatewellclass.org and click on the video link, it will take you to all of our webinars that have been recorded, and they're also available on our YouTube channel. So as I mentioned, there will be time at the end for some follow-up questions, and we're all out of the University of Illinois. Again, I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the Water Survey. I have with me Katie Hollenbeck from the Water Resources Center. She'll be taking your questions that you put in the question box today and handling the logistics. And I also have Dan Webb, who manages our public service lab at the Water Survey. And so a lot of the water quality questions, Dan and our public service lab have been around a long time. And until 2006, we offered free water testing to any well owner in Illinois for inorganics and metals. So we've got a long history of working with well owners in Illinois. We house the state's well logs. And so hopefully we can answer all your questions today, and if we can't answer a question, we'll try to find the answer and get back to you. So you just need to let us know, and we do have an email address. It's info@privatewellclass.org, where you can always ask us questions, whether about the webinar or just about your well in general, and we get a lot of those and answer a lot of questions regularly. So the important things to remember as a well owner is that your well's not regulated, except in a very few places in the country. So as the owner, it's really up to you. You're kind of the steward and the water operator for your very small water supply. And it's up to you to make sure the water's safe and that the system's maintained. And part of that, or a big part of that, is making sure you test. And so a lot of people feel like, well, my water tastes fine, it looks fine. But water can be the best tasting and look the safest in the world, but many contaminants are colorless, odorless, and have no taste, which means you don't even know they're there. So I grew up on an old dug well, 14 feet deep, 3-foot diameter brick-lined well on a small hog farm in central Illinois, and now I live in Champaign-Urbana in the community. And so I pay $40 to $50 a month for my water at my residence, which is on a public water supply. But that's the cost spread out over the 150,000 or so residents that are using that water. And so the water company uses that money to maintain all the lines from the plant, the treatment they do, the staff they have that have to fix every water line break and make sure that chemicals are added properly. All those sorts of things, so that when you turn on your tap and your water is safe and tasty, and that there is some, is your responsibility as a well owner. And so you need to remember that. Your well is an investment like a car, and so you need to take care of it, and you also need to protect your family by testing. And that's really the gist of what we hope to get through to everyone today. So what we try to teach, if you will, or make aware for well owners is that it's really about learning how your well works, understanding where your water's coming from. And so that starts with, if you have a well log, you can look at the geology of the log, how deep it is, and determine then using a professional, like even your state geological survey or a driller or some contractor, they can give you information about what that means. So whether your well's in sand and gravel or bedrock, if it's 300 feet deep or 30 feet deep, all those things matter. And hopefully, especially going through our 10-lesson class, you'll learn a lot about those things and types of wells. And so it's about you becoming better informed and understanding just because it comes out of the ground doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. Most of the time it is, but it's good for you to understand where there might be risks, or if your well is old, what the current construction code might be in your state, so that you're doing the right things to protect your water source. So if nothing else, what going through our lessons and these webinars will do for you is help you learn what the right questions are and who local contacts and sources of information might be. The bottom line is, except in a very few places on the East Coast, there are no regulations for wells as far as testing after you own the property or maintaining a certain water quality. So it's up to you. And those folks, like here in Illinois, our health department, at a county health department, their job is to help you if you have a question, and they may refer you back to us in Illinois. But in other states, it might be a different agency. In Iowa, it might be DNR, or in Wisconsin, it's DNR. It just depends on where you live. But finding out who those folks are gives you someone you can go to as a trusted source of information, and that's one of the things that we try to highlight, and it's actually part of one of the lessons in our class. So, and lastly, it's about sampling your well, and we'll talk a lot about that today. But the bottom line is, even if your well water tastes fine and you've never had any issues of, the way to be sure is just to sample your well regularly. So, yeah. So when it comes to water quality testing and your drinking water, there's always a lot of questions that come up. Where do I collect it? What do I test for? So we're going to go through this list first, and how often, all those sorts of things. And so as far as collecting your sample, the thing to note is if you have any kind of treatment, or depending on what kind of pipes you have in your house, the water coming out of your kitchen sink could be chemically different from the water that's at your outside tap if it comes straight from the well, or if you have a spigot that's out by the well, the water quality could just be different. So, there was a big scare 2 years ago or so, and what happened in Flint, Michigan. It's raised a lot of awareness about lead and lead pipes, lead solder, galvanized pipes, brass fittings, all those things. So if you have corrosive water, you could have an issue with lead getting in your drinking water, not from the well, but in your house itself because of your piping material. So understanding how old your house is, what kind of service lines you have, and all the piping in your home, and that's what I meant, the lines in your home, and what kind of treatment devices you have. So for instance, if you have an RO unit on your kitchen sink, your water is going to be it'll be free of a lot of things that might be in the well water, even if those are naturally occurring and not unhealthy necessarily, mineralogy and everything else. It just takes out a lot of material. So when you go to collect your sample, your lab should give you good detailed instructions. For instance, Dan will tell you when you call the State Water Survey's lab, he'll ask the first thing is if you have any treatment, and if so, usually he recommends you have 2 sets of samples done, one from an outside spigot that's before any treatment, so that gives you a good idea of what the groundwater quality is, and then one from your kitchen tap, which would be after any treatment, and you can get an idea then of how that might be changing the water chemistry of your water, just going through your home. What do you test for? Well, it really depends. There's a standard list of things that the EPA requires for community water supplies through the Safe Drinking Water Act. For a homeowner to do all of those things, some really wouldn't make sense because they deal with surface water issues, but the entire list will cost you a number of $1,000s. And so typically that's not what's done, but it depends on what kind of risks you might have, what formation the water is coming from. As far as risks, I mean, are you near anything? For instance, if your house is right next to a gas station, you might want to consider testing for some of those type of contaminants. And it also depends on the depth of your well. So if it's a shallow well and it's more susceptible to the surface, that might mean you test for a few additional things, where if it's a deeper well and it's newly constructed and it's following all the right construction code and everything else, you may have a smaller list of things that you want to test for. But it's also about understanding what you might need to test for in your area. For instance, in Illinois, we have a few areas where there's high arsenic. It doesn't show up in every well, but it shows up in certain aquifers in certain areas. And so calling your county health department in Illinois, for instance, you call Tazewell County and you ask them what you should test for, one of the extra things they'll tell you should probably test for is arsenic. And so it really depends on where you live. And so talk to your neighbors, talk to your driller. Co-op Extension might be able to help if they have a private well program or they've got extension staff who've worked with private well owners, or your county or local health department as well. And I guess in addition, in your state, most states don't have a water survey like Illinois does, but they all have a state geological survey, and a lot of those folks will have an idea as well. And here at the bottom it says, sample for coliform bacteria and nitrate annually. They indicate a pathway into your well. So coliform isn't necessarily harmful. It's not considered a bacteria that causes health effects, and nitrate necessarily either, except for pregnant women and small babies. Before, under 2, I guess, would be probably a good safe age. But they are very ubiquitous in our environment. So if you have coliform or nitrate in your well that's above a background level for nitrate, or any coliform bacteria in your well, it indicates a pathway into your well, which means other things can get in too. And because it's very cheap to test for coliform and nitrate, that's kind of what the health world has went to as far as a good cheap way to test annually to determine that your well is still properly protected and safe from surface influence, is just to test for those two things. So that's why that's recommended. So some examples. This is on the State of Rhode Island Department of Health's webpage. The little circles that are all over the map are where there used to be orchards where they used a lot of arsenic. And so they're telling you if you're in one of these areas near where there used to be an orchard, you probably should test your well for arsenic just to be safe. And that big splotch that's in the middle third of the state there is beryllium. So until we started this program, we don't have any beryllium naturally occurring in Illinois. And so I wasn't even aware until about 5 years ago that beryllium was a regulated contaminant, but it is. It has health effects. And if you live in Rhode Island in one of these areas, you probably should test for it to make sure it's not too high. And so the point here is to look at resources that might be available to you. I found this on the web. There's a lot of other information in different states that's available on the web. Massachusetts has this page set up through their Department of Environmental Protection. You type in your address. It'll tell you whether you're at risk if you have a bedrock well for either arsenic or uranium. And it's really just to protect you. They don't track this. It's a mapping tool, and it allows you to find information. You can see up on the right side here, there's a link to find a certified testing lab. And there's FAQs or fact sheets about what arsenic and uranium mean if they're in your drinking water. So it's just a way, as a well owner, it's information that helps you understand what risks you might have. Wisconsin, DNR heads the University of Stevens Point at Wisconsin, developed this nice web app. It's a mapping tool. I told it to display arsenic by county, and so it's showing from the private well data they have that they've collected at Wisconsin DNR what counties have shown higher levels on average of arsenic in the state. You can see the 3 red areas. The average sample in those 3 counties has been over 21. The health standard's 10 ppb. So as a well owner, if you lived in one of these areas and you found this, you might consider testing for arsenic. You might not have realized it might be an issue in your county. You can also narrow this down and look for other things. So it's really meant to be a help to a well owner in Wisconsin to understand what risks they might have again, and maybe help identify some areas where you might want to test for different things. And the last one I'll show is the state of Washington's. They've gone even a step further, that you can see the well log for many of these wells and all the blue dots, and I guess all the others as well. There's 2,231 locations here where they have water quality data for private wells. And if you live near one of these areas, you can zoom in and see what the water quality is, and even your neighbor's well, as it turns out, if it turns out you're that close. But it gives you an idea of water quality in the area. So, I live in Illinois. If I were to move to Washington State, I'd probably look at this if I was considering a home with a private well, just to see if the data was there or what aquifer they're in, and try to determine if there's other wells in that aquifer that might be on this map, and I could get some idea of what water quality might be. So there's a lot of helpful information if you just go look for it, and that's kind of the message here. And in Washington State, I do want to mention their Department of Ecology is the organization or the state agency that maintains well logs and also regulates well construction and drillers' licenses in the state. So they are the folks you'd contact there to find out more information. And if you had questions, or, I refer a lot of well owners who contact us back to the Department of Ecology for local help. So, yeah. So what we recommend, and this is really kind of an initial list, if you've never tested your well, we recommend doing this list here. Again, coliform and nitrate annually. There, again, is an indicator and a pathway into your well. If you have those issues, for instance, if you have a coliform problem, then you probably want to disinfect your well and see if it goes away. If it doesn't or it comes back, then you have a bigger issue. Maybe, there's a lot of things it could be. It may be a breach in your well. It may be that your well's too close and it's shallow to a septic system or a feedlot. There's a lot of reasons for that, but you need to start somewhere and then start investigating why those things might happen. This list in the middle really gives you a good general feeling of the chemistry of your groundwater. So, for instance, if your pH is 7.5, like it is in Illinois in most places, that's not acidic, so it's not as corrosive by itself as an indicator. High alkalinity can cause, and TDS, I guess, can cause that. Dan can talk more about that. But by collecting this list of things, the example I give people is I've got several monitoring well networks in Illinois where we sample them maybe every 10 years. And if I go out and sample in this deep aquifer, it's deeper, it's 300 or 400 feet below land surface, and the arsenic is 10, when I go back in 10 years, the arsenic's going to be close to 10 again. Or if it's 40, it's going to be close to 40. If the hardness is, 400, it should be close to that next time. And so, groundwater doesn't change that quickly, and unless the aquifer is really shallow and it's influenced by the surface, most of the chemistry stays fairly similar. And so that's one way you could identify a problem with your well, is if you went back and your pH was 6 in 5 years, then something's changed. And whether that's your well, or if it's something else in the area, it lets you know that maybe you should collect another sample and try to figure out why the chemistry's changed so dramatically, because it really shouldn't. And again, we always recommend contacting your local or county or state health department to ask what they recommend. They may know of some of the things I just showed you, beryllium, for instance, which is an oddity in my book anyway, and or if you have arsenic issues or things like that. So I want to show an example here. So this is a well in Illinois, and the interesting things here are this well was sampled for both. I'm going to run to the next slide and come back because I need to check this out here. Okay, yeah. So the sample is without any kind of treatment. So the sodium is 25.9. The hardness and alkalinity are in the 350s. The pH is 8.2. The turbidity is 29.8 over on the right side, and the color is 48.1. And this is from 2015, just 2 years ago. So then this is the raw sample that's collected from an outside spigot. And I'm just showing this as an example. Dan did this analysis, or one of his staff, and this is a well here in Illinois, not too far from Champaign. But then if we run it through, take a sample after the filter and the softener, you can see what's changed. Now the turbidity and color are 0.5 and 4.4, where they were in much higher numbers. The hardness has been reduced from 350 down to 0.68. the pH went up a little bit to 8.1 from 8.02, but look at the sodium on the left side near the top. It went from 26, I think it was, up to 198. So sometimes when you treat your water, like running it through a softener, you have unintended consequences. So if you're someone who's on a low sodium diet, now your drinking water isn't at 26 anymore, milligrams per liter, it's 198, and that could be an unintended consequence of everything else that you've done to soften your water and make it more palatable, if you will. And I'll just point out the less than symbols all mean it's less than detection limit for our equipment at this lab, in our public service lab. So then they also had an RO unit, or reverse osmosis system, on their kitchen tap. And so you can see once you've ran it through the RO unit, it's reduced everything mostly to non-detectable, which means it's taking out almost everything else that's there. A few things it doesn't, boron, there's still a little sodium left. And the interesting part to me here was the pH changed to 6.23. So by taking all that mineralogy out of your well water and your drinking water, you've taken out some of the buffering that manages your pH. And Dan could explain this a lot better than I can, but now the pH is down to 6.23, which is slightly corrosive. And so you can affect things just by adding treatment that you might not intend as well. So you should always talk to a qualified health professional, and having these analysis really is a great way to understand what's going on with your water system, is my take on this. So when should you test your well? As we've mentioned before, in addition to annually for coliform nitrate and every 3 to 5 years for basic mineralogy, anytime your well's been opened, if you've disinfected it because of a bad sample for coliform or E. coli, then you should test it again after you've done the disinfection. And anytime there's any kind of emergency event, so flood or fire. This is an example. The county in Colorado gave us some pictures after a forest fire of some of the rural homes that have been affected by the fire. And you can see here the caps laying on the ground. It's all melted. All the wiring's been melted together. Hopefully they had the power off to this before they left when the fire came. If not, then when these wires get melted together, sometimes it can kick your pump on and leave it on and burn it up. So there's just a lot of issues. They need to go back and fix all of this. And so when something dramatic like this happens, obviously you'd want to get everything back in place and all the equipment fixed, and then test it before you ever drink from it. So where to get it analyzed, and we've got a question that somebody asked at the end that I'll go into more detail, but where do you get it analyzed? We recommend using an accredited lab, and what that means is a lab that's been tested by the state in your state and is qualified to handle samples from a public water supply that has to sample regularly to meet the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Now, some of those labs only do community water supply samples, and they may not do a private well sample, but every state has a list, and I'll show an example of that later. But there's also, Iowa has a grants to counties program, for instance, where their state legislature gives money to the counties so that they can provide subsidized or free sampling. If you happen to live in Iowa or another state that may have a similar program, that's something to check out. It might save you some money. I know New Mexico has a program through their septic program that if you fill out all the information and identify where your septic is, so the state has a record of it, they'll provide you with a free water sample. And that's a one-time thing, but it's certainly a way to get that done. So, but when you talk to these labs, they should be able to give you detailed sampling instructions. Sometimes they mail you a kit. Sometimes you have to come pick it up. If you need to store the sample in ice, for instance, or if they give you a kit to ship it back. But you should ask questions until you're clear on what you need to do, what time frame you have to collect the sample and get it back to the lab, because some constituents are time sensitive, and then and everything else that might come up for you as far as, I don't have an outside spigot that's accessible, or, what do I do here? They should be able to answer your questions. And they should also be able to give you the bottles and everything else you need to do the analysis. I guess there's a point I didn't make here. I know, like in Pennsylvania, they have a set of rules for if you want a sample to be, quote, legally defensible, and I think this came about because some of the fracking issues out there, then sometimes you may even need to have the lab to come out and do the sampling for you. And that's a different issue. You need to talk locally with someone to find that out. But in the end, a good lab will give you all the information you need, and you should be satisfied with their answers. And if not, you should try a different lab. That's my take on it. And, we do a webinar for labs annually. And I know this last year we did one. We had 138 different labs that were on the call, and I told them the same story. What I tell well owners is that they should be able to answer their questions. If not, find a different lab, because they need to be able to explain all this information to you as a well owner and get you on the right path. So as far as interpreting the results, as I said here, you can use websites and documents that are online to get a sense of what your results might mean. But our take is you should always take them to your local or county health department and get a qualified answer from a health professional. Sometimes if you're typing values on a website to get an idea of what your samples might be, your results might mean, you can slip a digit, or you can use the wrong units, or they expect you to answer in specific units, and that might cause you an alarm that's not necessary. And so it's much better to go talk to a public health professional. They may even be able to say, well, looking at this analysis, this doesn't quite make sense. Something might have got contaminated with your sample. Maybe you should resample, or things like that. And we recommend, if you've found something in your well, especially if you have coliform E. coli, and it's always good to resample to confirm. And if you do sample for coliform, then the next step would be to do an E. coli test. And either way, you should boil your water that you're drinking until you can chlorinate or disinfect it. And it's been tested, and it's clear that that's gone. Because many times, if you have coliform or E. coli, the source is still there somewhere in the ground, whether that's a septic system or whether that's a hole in your casing. And so it's going to come back. So you disinfect your well. It may be fine for a few weeks, and then whatever it is may be back. Groundwater is always moving under the ground. It's not sitting still. And so you need to be sure that it's not a one-time problem, like from a well being opened or some other issue before you start drinking it again. So going back to the online sort of information that's available, the one site we recommend is put up by the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. It's called the Be Well Informed Guide. And this is information that they've put up for the residents in New Hampshire, but this information works for anyone. And it uses what the guidelines are for the Safe Drinking Water Act for community water supplies. So, the standard for arsenic in a community water supply is 10 parts per billion. And so that's what this guide uses, and says if your sample's over that, then it's considered unsafe. But what this provides you is a tool that you can go in and get a first look, if you will, or an idea of what your water sample might mean. And this also has the added advantage that it also recommends treatment types, so that you know that, for instance, if you have higher arsenic, there's only a couple ways you can really treat that, and this goes through what those examples are. So you can click on, see here at the bottom it says enter your well water test results. I entered 15 micrograms per liter, which is the same as ppb. You can see that's a drop down. Milligrams per liter, micrograms per liter, parts per million, and parts per billion. So milligrams per liter is parts per million, and micrograms per liter is parts per billion. And so it depends on how the particular lab you use decides to report that, but you need to make sure your units match. If you put in 15 milligrams per liter, for instance, instead of micrograms per liter, that's 15,000 micrograms per liter when the standard's 10. So you need to be careful with your units. So anyway, I put in 15 ppb, or micrograms per liter of arsenic, and told it to, I submitted that, and it said, your arsenic value is over the drinking water standard. And it's telling me that I can use point of use absorptive media, a GAC filter, for instance, or an RO, or reverse osmosis unit, to remove those, to remove that arsenic. And POU means point of use. So if you hear the term POE, which means point of entry, or whole house filter, that's the same as a point of entry. And what you need to understand about that is if your, say your arsenic was 15, the standard's 10, that's really not much over the limit. And if you put a RO unit on your kitchen tap, that's the water you should be using for your drinking and cooking. You really don't need a whole house RO unit, and that will cost a lot of money, and it's just not necessary in that case. And so knowing the difference between point of use versus point of entry or whole house is really important as far as the economics of your situation. There'd be no reason to have a whole house RO unit. Well, I can't say there would never be a reason, but there's I can't think of very many instances where that would be necessary. So it also gives you an interpretation of those results. And again, this was meant for the residents in New Hampshire, but it really works for all of us, fortunately. And so it's a great tool, and it gives you a lot of information. Some of the information might be New Hampshire specific. And, you can go then to your local health department and ask what information they may have on this issue and go from there. Okay. So as far as interpreting results, again, these tools are really just a guide for typical waters, and you should always take your sample results to your health department to get a qualified answer. So, and again, their job is to help you and ensure your water is safe to drink, and so they want you to come to them. And that's the best thing you can do. So in this bottom statement, there may be a few counties here and there or local health districts here and there on the East Coast that now have laws basically that to ensure the water quality. But in the vast majority of the country, and you can find this out on your own, a health department can't tell you to stop drinking your water. Matter of fact, we run across well owners all the time who we say, hey, there's a lot of arsenic in this area, and they don't care. They basically say, hey, I've drank this my whole life. My grandpa lived here. Everything's good. We appreciate it, but we're going to keep drinking it anyway. And you can't stop, a health department can't stop somebody from drinking the water from their own well. Okay, so correcting poor construction. A lot of times, water quality problems in wells are because the well is old. It's either got a breach or it wasn't constructed up to the current code such that it's safe. So, for instance, we did a survey of a bunch of wells in central Illinois in a rural area, and we found probably 30 or 40 wells out of 1,700 that are still in pits. And, you can't legally put a well in a pit today in Illinois, but those wells were grandfathered in. And so there's also a lot of hand-dug wells. And the risk there is, especially a pit, water can get in there. It's a safety hazard. It also is an opportunity for surface contamination. If you have a big rainstorm, that pit may fill with water. Unless your well cap is completely sealed the way it's supposed to be, you're going to get stuff leaking in to your well. And they're also a safety hazard. So a lot of times you end up not having a cover on those that is adequate. May forget about it, run over it with a tire or a mower, or even just stepping on it, you can fall through, those sorts of things. And so they're really just not the best way to have your well and protected. So here's a couple examples. The one on the left is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They have a blog where they put up information. There used to be a piece of plywood over this entire well, the corrugated vertical pipe you see there. It got old or moldy. The woman stepped on it, fell through, and it killed her. But there was obviously a concrete block over that hole. That was how they got in the well. You can see insulation all around it. You can see that old funnel sitting there. Just not a safe way. Stuff can fall in. Mice can fall in. And all those sorts of things. And the picture on the left, or on the right, that's a goat. It fell in this well, and it speaks for itself. So not only Is that going to be quite an issue to clean up if they're going to try? They probably need to just put in a different well and seal this one up. But not having it properly protected at the surface means, something a lot bigger than a bacteria got in their well in this case. So it's really a problem. So what do you do with these wells? You need to, the best thing you can do is bring them up to the current construction code. And if you're in Alaska or Pennsylvania where you don't have construction code, use in other states or talk to your driller. Find out what best practices maybe from the National Groundwater Association to their Master Driller program, and extend the pipe up to the surface, fill that pit in with clay, install a pitless if you need to, and then find out what the best approach is using either a contractor or your well authority in your state or county to be sure that in the end you have a well that's safe and protected from the surface. So like in Illinois, our county health departments inspect new wells that are constructed, and so those folks have some wherewithal to give you advice on what the best approach might be as well. And it depends on which state you live in, how those rules are implemented. And some they do inspect, and some states they don't. And so that's kind of where we're at. The other issue is abandoned wells. So in most states, well logs weren't required until the 60s to the 80s. In Illinois, it was 1968. In New York, it was 2000. So before they were required to be filed with the state, so the drillers have that information, but it's not really publicly available. And so in many cases, we have a lot more undocumented wells than we do documented wells on file. So what that means is there's a ton of wells out there that we don't even know where they're at. They may not be used anymore. The house may be gone. And so just like a well in a pit, they're a safety hazard. And if you, for you as a well owner, if you're on a property and you know there's another well or an old dug well that's not being used anymore, you need to fill it in. They're a safety risk and needs to be properly abandoned, because if someone falls in or gets hurt or it contaminates the aquifer, you could be responsible. And, we see, well, I'll just go to the next slide. I believe it's here. Yeah. On the left are two pictures from, the Washington State Department of Ecology. Those both happened in the same year, where a horse fell in a well, and then the bottom one, a man fell 45 feet into his well, or an old abandoned well. And he was lucky enough to survive and walk away from it. But very surprising. On the left, I'm dyslexic today, I'm sorry. On the right, those are three of those four newspaper clippings are from Illinois. The third one is from Midland, Texas. If you're old enough to remember Jessica McClure, it was CNN covered her recovery when she got stuck in a well live for 18 hours. They had to dig her out, and it was on national TV coverage for almost the entire length of that issue. She's fine, grown woman today, has her own kids. The other three articles are all from local or regional papers in Illinois. The bottom one is from the Springfield State Journal Register. A woman fell and they found her body, a well near their home. That's in the center part of the state. The Galesburg one at the top is in the western part of Illinois, and the second one is from one of the Chicago suburbs. So Buffalo Grove girl died right before her 11th birthday. All these happened in the same year, and so the issue is that a lot of this doesn't make national news or even state news. So the folks in Springfield probably didn't know about the girl in Buffalo Grove or in Galesburg, especially back in that time, that those things happened. And so it happens more frequently than people realize. And, there are, we estimate in Illinois, we have about, we house the state's well logs here at the State Water Survey, and we have about 500,000 well logs. There's probably between 800,000 and a million wells in use in Illinois, and there's probably at least half that many, if not more, abandoned wells that aren't being used that we don't have any idea where they're at. So it's a big issue, and again, if you know you have an old dug well that needs to be filled in, or any kind of abandoned well that's not being used, you should take care of that as just a safety practice for you and your family and your neighbors and everybody else. Okay, so that's what I have as kind of a scripted program today. The rest of these is all Q&A. So when you registered for this webinar, you were taken to a page where you could add your own questions. And so we've taken a number of those, not all of them, but a number of them. We've tried to answer here, Dan and I, before the webinar today. So first question, how could having high coliform in my non-drinking water harm my family? So just to make everyone aware, by non-drinking water, what I'm guessing is these folks have either an RO unit or something at their kitchen tap, so they're doing their drinking water and their cooking from just that tap. And everything else, their shower, their toilets, all that, brushing their teeth from a sink in the bathroom, is all non-drinking water as the way this is defined here. So coliform, again, isn't harmful. It's not considered harmful. Having it in your water doesn't mean that somebody's going to get sick. It's an indicator as a pathway into your well or your water system. So the first question I have is, have you tested for E. coli? So because if you have E. coli, then really you shouldn't use it for anything. No showering, dishes, brushing teeth, just really for flushing your toilets. And the bottom line is, if you have coliform, that means there's a pathway into your well or your water system, and for any other bacteria or pathogen. So it's really just not a good practice to say, hey, I've got coliform, so I'm going to treat this a little bit and not do anything to the rest, because it means there's a way into your well for other things that you wouldn't want to be taking a shower in, or you wouldn't want to be brushing your teeth. So, Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, it gets to be a complicated issue, and that what you say is exactly right. The coliforms aren't necessarily considered harmful themselves, but especially if you have E. coli, you want to be careful. I mean, you'll probably see advice out there that some things you don't have to worry about coliforms, but I'm backing up what Steve says.
All right. Yeah, Dan, you can take the next several of these are all about water quality, so you answered.
Okay.
You should go ahead.
The next question was, what effects can high total dissolved solids have on people? Total dissolved solids themselves, if they're high, they don't necessarily have a health effect associated with them. They're regulated, or there's a standard set by the US EPA, but it's a secondary maximum contaminant level, which means it's based on aesthetic reasons like taste, and there's several other things, taste, odors, rather than health reasons. The EPA's level is 500 parts per million or milligrams per liter. The water might taste funny, might taste salty. In our lab, we see water that has above 500 on a fairly routine basis. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but if you have high TDS in the water, it can also make the water more corrosive, which might lead to other problems like leaching of lead from lead pipes or solder or fixtures.
Okay.
Yeah, I suppose it also, I should add in there, it depends on what the TDS is. A lot of times it's just some of your basic minerals that come from the aquifer, like calcium, magnesium, bicarbonates. If it's all sodium chloride, and there's sodium in there too, and there's some chloride and some sulfate, but if your water is, say, 600 parts per million and it's all sodium chloride or a sulfate in there, then you're going to have other effects. The sulfates can cause their own issues, laxative effects, and other things.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. You want me to go on?
Yep. Keep going.
Okay. The next question is, what effects can high turbidity have on people? The turbidity is something that's considered a national drinking water standard, and the EPA states, it's shown here on the slide, that high levels of turbidity are often associated with higher levels of disease-causing microorganisms such as viruses, parasites, and some bacteria. That being said, we see a lot of turbidity mostly from iron. You can also, in private wells, the EPA oversees the municipal supplies where they might treat the water, and then maybe after it's missing all the sediment that may come from the raw water, they might look at turbidity a little differently. But what we see is most of the turbidity that you can see is due to iron and sediment. So my suggestion is to treat the turbidity there by putting in a sediment filter after your pressure tank. That should remove most of it. It doesn't guarantee that there's not any of the microorganisms still present, so it'd be a good idea to test your water, for, like Steve had mentioned earlier, for the coliform bacteria. And I think that's all I had there. Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Is testing for total coliform, E. coli, and nitrate enough to tell if the water is safe to drink? Yeah.
Oh, I put this in here, I guess. I forgot I threw this one back in. So this gets to the point that a lot of times there could be other things in your well. So natural occurring arsenic or lead in premise plumbing. So some counties will allow, like at a sale of a home, to just test for coliform and nitrate, and if those are okay, they will let that sale go through. But again, we suggest you talk to a health professional in your area and at your state level to understand, what you might need to do, what other things there could be. Safe is a really arbitrary word, and we get that question a lot. Is it safe to drink? And it's, it really depends on what level of comfort you want to have there. And, I guess the example I'll give is we had someone here in Illinois contact us about 2 years after they bought their home, and the health department had agreed that their well was considered safe, a county health department, after they just tested for coliform and nitrate, and they both came back okay. And 2 years later, she contacted us, and she'd done a much more extensive analysis on her own. And this homeowner was really upset, wanted to know why no one had told her there's these issues. They're in an area where there's high arsenic, and their arsenic level is 150 ppb. She feels like she was betrayed by the system and thinks the laws in Illinois should be changed. And I spent a lot of time trying to explain to her that there's really no political will to do that, and it's, buyer beware. And that's what we tell people who are buying a home all the time. You want to test it and pay for that analysis yourself if you have to, and make sure you've tested it for as much as you can, because you don't want to find out later you bought a home with the well that's high in, arsenic or uranium or whatever, and because then you've got to treat it, and if you decide to sell it, it become an issue. I know in Illinois the law says if you are selling a home, you have to disclose if you know of any adverse effects from your water quality or your septic and those sorts of things. And so the people who sold it put they didn't, and unless you can prove they did know that in advance, you don't have any legal recourse. So it comes down to, in general, I would say I'd want to know more than just coliform and nitrate myself. So, all right.
Okay, good, Steve. Thanks.
Oh, I skipped one there. Hang on. Okay, so this gets back to I mentioned we'd had more information about qualified labs. So on EPA's website, they've got a drinking water lab certification program where they certify labs in every state, or the states certify them and keep this list up, or help them keep this list up. And it links to each state's primacy agency, like in Illinois, that's the Illinois EPA. And so they're the organization in the state that regulates and ensures that community water supplies are meeting the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So you can go to this website and you can find labs. So you can find a lot of information about what they do to certify them. They've got to be consistent, they've got to be compliant with all the regulations and all that stuff. And then you can start looking at contact information for these programs and the labs. So they've got this page. You can click on your state or use the drop down, and it'll take you to, like, again, I just used Illinois, and you can click on this and see a list of accredited labs in Illinois depending on what you're testing for. So there's two things to know. One, at least in Illinois and in many states, a number of the labs, probably the majority of the labs they list, are not in Illinois. because you can send them overnight to a lab anywhere, basically. And so there's labs, in order to increase their own business, have got certified in other states. And so, there's labs from California and Massachusetts on this list. And so you need to be aware of that. The other thing to be aware of is some labs use the accredited method for testing for a certain compound or element or constituent when they're testing for community water supply for the Safe Drinking Water Act, but they may use a less rigorous, cheaper method to test for a private well. And so it's a question you should ask. And it's not that common, so I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but in some cases they're using two different methods for a community water supply sample to test for arsenic than they might be for a private well. And you want to use the more rigorous method that they've been vetted by the state and all that stuff to ensure you're getting accurate results. So that's my take on things. I guess the only other thing I'll mention as a plug to our lab, the public service lab at the Water Survey, like a number of university labs, I know Virginia Tech has one and so does Texas A&M, used to be accredited by the EPA, but their accrediting requirements have become so cumbersome that economically it wasn't feasible to maintain that. So, 15 years ago our lab was still accredited and we use all the EPA methods and all that stuff, and now we're not, but we still use all the same methods and do all the rigorous water quality analysis that's required. So, when I do a project where I'm working with well owners, I still use our lab here at the Water Survey because the results are defendable. They use blanks and all that other stuff, whereas they would not be on this list now. And so I just want to point that out if you're in one of those states. Dan, anything to add?
No, good points, and thank you for the plug, Steve.
Okay, here you go.
Okay, this comes up quite often, probably one of our most common questions. How do I eliminate sulfur or rotten egg smell and brown rusty color? Typically, the sulfur smells are attributed to sulfur or sulfate reducing bacteria, and chlorination is typically a good treatment for that. The idea is here you're going to kill the bacteria, and the chlorine should also oxidize the gas that would probably eliminate the odor. If you can't get rid of the bacteria or the hydrogen sulfide smell, you may need to go to continuous chlorination. I've had some health department people tell me that they'll have customers shock chlorinate their well several times before they get rid of it, kind of like removing one slime layer at a time. The brown rusty color is also very common. In my experience, it's almost always due to precipitation of iron that's been dissolved. It could be that it gets past a sediment filter, so I would add a sediment filter first. Looks like we've listed here a common pore size is a 0.5 micron. If the water has iron in it after that, and it often does, it'll often precipitate out afterwards. So most people will put in a softener or some type of an iron filter, like an oxidizing iron filter. Tannins are also listed. The treatment for tannins is a little bit more complicated, but it can. I've seen. I suppose carbon filters can help with that a little bit. There's anion exchange resins. You have to be a little bit careful with those. They might take out other carbonates and make the water corrosive. I haven't really dealt with that too much, but tannins are another thing that can cause the brown rust color.
Okay, thank you.
Somebody
asked about an anode rod, right?
Yeah, I was just going to go there.
Okay.
Some people will just notice the sulfur smell in their hot water heater. If you can tie it to your hot water, they usually say that's attributed to these sulfate reducing bacteria that are growing in the hot water heater. And it used to be people would say, oh, take out the anode rod. I think you'll see that that's generally not recommended because the rod's there for a purpose. It's a sacrificial rod, and it will corrode itself as opposed to tank components corroding, like the walls of the tank or the fittings. I think most hot water heaters are glass lined, but they say it can still reach some of the walls of the tank and some of the fittings. So generally, they say don't just take the rod out. You'll see some people say exchange it out for a aluminum rod that may not be so problematic with the smells, but I've seen other people say that those can be just as problematic. I've seen references to powered anode rods. I haven't used them or really talked to people that use those, but they're non-sacrificial, I believe, and I think they're more expensive, but they should also solve the problem. But some other advice that I think you'll see is that just disinfecting the hot water tank can be a good solution. I think usually I'll see people do that with hydrogen peroxide. You could probably also use bleach. Sometimes I've seen people say turn the water temperature up to above 140 degrees for several hours. But if you do that, make sure you turn it back down so the water's not scalding when it comes out the taps.
All right, thanks, Dan.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, so someone asked, does a granular activated carbon filter remove PAHs, which are polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, which is like from gas exhaust? And so we did a little work looking into this, and I couldn't find anything specifically mentioning that GAC will remove this particular type of hydrocarbon. So in the EPA treatability database, you can search for granular activated carbon, and it does list a number of hydrocarbons in the list that it says it treats. And again, these are for community water supplies. But I also found from the World Health Organization a list of all the PAHs that they had tested for some stuff. And, as far as I could tell, there was no overlap in those types of hydrocarbons. So what I did find, though, in researching this is that it's really unlikely that you'd have PAH problems in groundwater, mainly because they're have a very low solubility and a really high affinity for particulate matter. So if they're getting into the soils, they're usually binding to the soil. And so there's a lot more remediation work where it's removal of soil and that sort of thing. And the only places where these things have ever shown up in groundwater is when you're right next to a source. And so, my question is this a known concern you have, or is this a precautionary concern? Has someone mentioned this? Or, are you next to some kind of site where there's been contamination that you know of? And that would really help us understand where this question's coming from, because we've never had this come up before, and it doesn't seem, from what I've read, and I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but enough to at least have a feel for what I think's going on, and it really just should not be an issue. So if you're just worried about it, it seems like there should be a low concern because of, like I said, because it's not very soluble. And also, but yeah, give us some more information. There's our email address, and we can certainly ask others, like at our state EPA office, if they've ran across that in groundwater, any of our community supplies. And but yeah, in the EPA treatability database, which lists all the different kinds of treatment and what kinds of constituents they can take out, they weren't listed there. So that would tell me no.
Hey, Steve, I have one other addition.
Oh, feel free. So.
Since you mentioned the EPA treatability database, I just thought I'd point out that NSF also has I don't remember exactly what they call it, a drinking water devices database where you can go in and select these types of things, and they'll show recommended treatment to take care of it. I don't know if PAHs are in there. I appreciate your looking into this issue because I hadn't really dealt with them before either. But I just thought I'd mention that another resource.
Sure. Okay. So I tested my water, and all the tests say the water is fine. How do I improve well water to be drinking water? So, again, we need more information because what's fine is the same as saying it's safe. Is that just coliform nitrate testing? Is it, $2,000 worth of all the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements? Understanding what you've already tested for, is one consideration to answer this question. The thing to remember is well water is drinking water. I drink well water, even though I live on a community water supply. So that water's tested. It comes out of a well. They have the only American Water Company that runs our water system has 12 or 14 wells around the area that are all tapping the sand and gravel aquifer. The water comes into their treatment plant. It's tested. It's treated for whatever they need to treat for, and when it goes out into the distribution system, it does go out with a chlorine residual, which is required by law to keep bacteria from forming in your distribution system, but nothing else is done to it to treat it necessarily. And you still see in many states that they don't require chlorine necessarily for a homeowners association that may have a small water system or a place like that that's considered a public water supply, but it's pretty small. And in some cases, the groundwater quality is such that they do absolutely no treatment. They're just distributing it to everyone. And so, yeah, well water is drinking water. And it's a matter of what's being treated, what you're doing at your home to treat it, as far as softness and some of those things if you're using a softener or a filter or whatever. But, yeah, so the only difference is the city of Champaign-Urbana, for instance, where I live, requires that they meet all of those requirements that are in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And again, it gets back to when you had your water tested and they said the water's fine, what would they test it for? Because generally that's not tested for all of those things. So, that's one of the issues that we've uncovered and really work with different counties and states around the country with our partners from RCAP, is to try to make everyone realize that people in different parts of the country are testing for different things, and some are testing for many more things than others. And so, in Massachusetts, for instance, there's over 500 local public health districts. Some of those have their own requirements for testing, and others, like when a property sold, and others don't. So you could move 3 blocks in a given area in Massachusetts from one health district to another health district and go from having to test for coliform and nitrate to having to test for $1,000 worth of different constituents. And so understanding that difference is, I guess, where I'm getting at. We need to know more information about what fine really means. But there is no improving your well water. I know, Dan, I think you'd mentioned to me, that could be making it softer water if it's hard water by adding a softener, or putting in a GAC filter on a kitchen tap if it has a funny taste, or you're removing taste, or even a color. So
yeah, that was my
improvements. So
my take on it was, if we're saying that everything's fine, Steve made some really good points about the differences and on how people interpret fine. But the way I was interpreting the question was, like Steve says here in the beginning, if there are aesthetic issues, sometimes there are municipal supplies where you'll notice a funny taste, or you don't like the hardness, things like that. So municipal people might do the same things. They might put in a softener. They might put in a activated carbon filter. If you're really concerned, often people will turn to reverse osmosis. It'll take out about 90% of dissolved materials. It's not a guarantee. It's not the same as, say, completely distilled water. But often, if you're really annoyed with aesthetics, then you can look at some of those other treatments.
all right, thank you. So one of the other questions you got, I work at a forest preserve and provide water at fountains and rental facilities. I'm interested in well maintenance and best practices. We have a number of webinars that we do. One's called Well Care 101. We also have the class itself, the private well class. And, many times we ask that question when we're doing a webinar, or if we're doing a live workshop somewhere for well owners. Have you taken our class? And, only 10% of the people raise their hands. I certainly encourage everyone to take our free class. If you go to privatewellclass.org, you can sign up for it's the mailed lessons, and they come once a week to your mailbox. They're between 6 and 8 pages of material, and they're on specific topics. It's a lot more detail. We have a list of best practices for maintaining your well, for instance, and it's more than I can get into here as far as going through. If you really want a good answer for maintaining those and what best practices you should use, it would be better if you went through that material. And so I just point that out. We just did this webinar last month. We try to do one webinar a month, sometimes two. They're not all for well owners. Sometimes they're for, we do one for realtors, and we do one for environmental health professionals specifically. And so you can go back through, though, and I believe there's close to 30 of our past webinars, and some of those are, the same over again with different questions like this at the end, where the main material at the beginning is the same. Because, like, for instance, we did this webinar back in January as well, and the first part of this is the same. It's just the questions are different. So I encourage you to check that information out, and there's a lot of good stuff there as far as what you should be doing for maintaining your well. Okay. Does the water change after a heavy rain, and for better or worse? We've noticed some changes. So it really shouldn't change. If the well's properly protected from the surface and it's not a vulnerable aquifer where it's directly influenced by either surface runoff or direct infiltration, and if you are seeing changes, it means that one of those things is the case. An example I'll give you is the hand-dug well I grew up on. My grandpa hand-dug it in 1933. He put it in a ravine in the bottom of a V, if you will, so that everything ran towards it, so that we would always have water. It was also in the middle of a pasture that had cows and sheep. And when we had a big rainstorm, our water was cloudy for 2 or 3 days that came out of our taps. I'm sure if it was tested, it would have coliform and probably E. coli. Anything else that might have been, there's a cornfield on one side. So it shouldn't show any influence as a bottom line. It's not a good thing. It means your drinking water is probably influenced by the surface. So, and I said test more frequently. That may have, you just need to test and see if you're seeing any changes, if there is coliform, E. coli, or nitrate, and then you need to determine if it's the aquifer or if it's well construction. So some examples of an aquifer that might be vulnerable is if you're in a sandy area where you have a very shallow well that, obviously surface water is going to directly influence or directly infiltrate into the sand and get into your well. Or if you have an old dug well, it's not really getting water from an aquifer, it's getting water from the shallow water table, and like the well I grew up on is directly influenced by surface water and rainfall. Or it could be in a karst area or where bedrock's at the surface, where in karst topography, a lot of times surface water runs right into those, into the bedrock. That's what forms caves and underground springs and all those things. And so we see a lot of problems in those areas as well. We have a county in Illinois that's all karst topography and geology, and the health department there sees about 80% of their samples come back positive for coliform. And so if it's the aquifer and you're a vulnerable aquifer, there's really nothing you can do to protect your well from that. So in that case, you have to take steps to disinfect your water and try to protect it. So the best example I have is like in Tennessee, they have a lot of springs where water's coming out of the rock and they're using a spring for their drinking water. Those all have coliform in it, and so they either use continuous chlorination or they've got a UV unit to disinfect their well or disinfect their water. And so that's what you'd need to do in that case. So, and if it's the well's not properly constructed and there's a breach in the casing, or it's in a pit, or some other reason why water can get into that well, so if it's a deeper well but it's still having this problem, then you need to try to find out what you might be able to do to fix that. and seal it so that, your well's not influenced by the surface anymore. All right, that's all I have on that. Yeah, it just shouldn't. I know we had someone send us a sample. They were getting ready to buy a house, and they said it's a shallow dug and bored well, and they wanted to know if there was any problem. And so Dan in our lab tested it, and they came back to me and said, hey, this looks like it's rainwater. And so I contacted the person and said, there might be a problem with this water. They said it's got all the characteristics of rainwater. And sure enough, there'd been a big rainstorm the night before. And so that was a big red flag to them not to purchase the home, or at least to get it put in there into the purchase that a new well be put in, because that one was vulnerable to surface contamination. So those things matter. What education and outreach is available to inform residents about their private drinking water well, and how do I communicate testing needs to people? So we've ran this program for nearly 5 years, a little over 4 years. And so if you're a professional who works with well owners, you should just contact us. I put my email address here, as well as the one for our general email address for questions. We've done a lot of work working through RCAP, which is the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. They're kind of the lead on our program, and they have staff in every state that work with well owners or with those that serve well owners. So, yeah, we can work with you directly. We've developed a newsletter that's just for people who, for sanitarians and extension and drillers and people that work with well owners. I mentioned here at the bottom, we put together a 4-hour workshop. We did a research study working with CDC where we reached out to 100 programs around the country that do outreach and education to well owners, and we asked them, we did a survey of what was successful, what wasn't, what they do differently, what they learned and all their experiences, and we developed a 4-hour workshop on that. What's about half of it is on just that material, and we've delivered that in 24 states already, and we've also done it twice online as a 4-hour webinar. And we'll probably do another online webinar later this year. And so you can contact us. It's just what we've learned over the last 5 years or 6 years, as well as the experiences we've had. Like for myself, I've been at this nearly 30 years, and I work with well owners in Illinois for most of that time. And so, it's different everywhere. That's the bottom line, and a lot of times they're not that interested. And so we've come up with some things that we've learned from other folks around the country on what works and doesn't work, and what might be helpful as far as building your own program. And I would also, so get a hold of us, give me a call or email me, and we can talk about all those things. And the nice thing is our program's funded, RCAP is the lead for our program. They fund us, but it's all funded through US EPA, so everything we do is free. The workshops are free. We're actually putting on a national conference next month that's bringing in people from all over the country to talk about well issues, and there's information on our webpage about that. And again, and that conference is actually free. So, and that's only for professionals, not for well owners themselves. So get a hold of us. So a little bit more about the class. I've already done some of that. It's 10 lessons. If you go to privatewellclass.org, on the left side it says Learn by Mail. If you're a well owner, click on that, sign up. It just asks for your first name, what state you live in, and your email address, and you'll start getting one lesson a week for 10 weeks. And they walk through everything from here's the basics of hydrology and how water flows through the ground, to well types, to common problems people have with their wells, low pressure, all that sort of stuff, all the way up to treatment and, things you can do. And it's a great resource. This is the page I was mentioning. This is our front page, actually. If you click on Learn by Email, it'll take you to that. We've developed some short videos, and we've actually got podcasts, and so you can learn a lot about wells just by looking at all this information, and it's all free. Here's where you sign up. As I said, it's just your email address, your first name, and where you live. And part of that is really just to count beans, if you will, or to inform EPA that we're actually reaching people all over the country. We've had over 5,000 people take this class already, which is great. But there's 15 million plus private wells in the country, and so it's really just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. And so yeah, share this and tell us what you think. There's a evaluation at the end, and we try to always strive to make it better if we can. And it's pretty useful. We've got a lot of positive feedback from it. Along with that, on our webpage is a resource library for each lesson. The first lesson is called The Science of Groundwater. We put a number of resources that are all free and publicly available from other states or other organizations, and just to help, to give you further reading as a well owner, and specific information like the first one under the second lesson is the Michigan Flowing Well Handbook. A lot of states don't have flowing wells, but Michigan certainly does. And so they've developed even a complete handbook on what to do with those and how to keep your well from flowing, as far as to seal it so it's not wasting all that groundwater. Like I said, there's a lot of good resources out here. This webinar is one of many. As I mentioned, this shows that there are 23 webinar recordings, but there's more like 28 now, I believe. And in August, we did one just about lead. So if you're concerned about lead, I encourage you to just watch this video. We use resources from some of the folks at Virginia Tech and from US EPA that have looked at some of these issues a lot harder than we have. And we even have a web page where you can find resources from CDC and EPA on best practices and information, so that you're aware of what it means to be lead-free, for pipes and solder and all those things, because there's just a lot of information out there. And so we've tried to vet that material and put what we think is useful to you as a well owner. And that's the way we've done this webinar as well. We have short videos, I mentioned, really simple 3 to 5 minute videos on one particular question. How does my private well system work? How does my pressure tank work? What is an artesian aquifer? What is a dug well? There's 16 of these. At some point there'll be more, but they're just meant to give you a good concept of what's going on with that particular thing. I know, I think we've had nearly 100,000 views of these in a little over a year and a half. One of the videos in particular, How Does My Pressure Tank Work?, has had over 60,000 views by itself. That tells us that there's not a lot of good information out there about pressure tanks, and also it's one of the biggest issues well owners have, is how to maintain the pressure in their system. And so, things like that are really useful to us as well, to understand what's going on out there. And so the whole point of all this in the end is that as a well owner, we're trying to give you what we feel is the best targeted information and advice about your well, so that you understand that it is important that you understand it and why it's important, why you need to understand how it works so you can ask better questions, and also then that all leads to how to protect you and your family from any kind of risk. And so it's really worthwhile to go through all that and participate in these webinars. We certainly appreciate everyone's time. And, if you have questions, we're here. I put up the URL, or the email address for our site email is just info@privatewellclass.org. And so I think that's all I have today. We do have a number of questions that you've asked in the question box. And so what I'm going to do is get out of this webinar, or get out of this PowerPoint, and I'm going to pull up the questions. Through the magic of Google, we're able to, let's hang on one second here, sorry about that. We're able to share our screen, Katie and I, and so let me move this over. And if I make it full screen, hopefully everybody can see that. Yeah. And so these are the questions we have. It looks like there's, okay, let's just start at the top. Is UV light good enough for drinking water if my water is satisfactory for bacteria and nitrate? So UV is ultraviolet disinfection, right? Ultraviolet light, and it kills bacteria and viruses and everything else. Depending on contact time, and there's a lot of rules. It's being used more and more for public water supplies as well, because of areas where chlorine and disinfection byproducts from chlorine disinfection are causing problems, their own health problems. So is it good enough for drinking water? It's used for killing bacteria. And so if you don't have bacteria, you probably don't need to have a UV system. And maybe I'm getting that wrong in reading your question. But it doesn't really do anything for nitrate. It kills pathogens, and that's what it's for. It actually renders
Yeah, that's what I was leaning towards that too, Steve, wondering if usually it's used to kill pathogens, and I wasn't sure if you'd need it for anything if you didn't have that.
Yeah, it doesn't really do anything else. So yeah, it won't do anything about nitrate, as I don't believe. Is pH 6 is not good enough for drinking? There's water. I know in Virginia they've got water that's less than that, 5.5, 4.5 in some cases. Some aquifers just have very low pH water. It doesn't mean it's better or worse. What it means is, typically if your water has a pH of 6, and Dan's probably the better person to answer this, it's not really harmful to you, but it could make it corrosive, where it could affect copper pipes or lead pipes or galvanized pipe or lead solder or brass and cause leaching of things like lead and copper. And so that's really the only concern, I think.
Yeah, I think I don't want to say for sure, but keep in mind reverse osmosis water is usually down in that range, around 6.5, maybe a little bit lower. And if you were to buy a bottle of distilled water at the store, it's going to be down at around 6 or a little bit lower maybe. So I've heard some people, they might say, oh, if you do drink that water, you're not getting enough minerals. So I guess that could be a issue, but I wouldn't say that's an issue really. There's something else I was going to say about that, but I can't remember what it was now. So, as far as harmful is concerned too, another thing you can consider is your drinks. A lot of your commercial drinks, sodas, of course, but Gatorade, juices, they all have pretty low pHs too. So and I wouldn't say orange juice is going to be bad for you. So
right, yeah, pop is certainly much lower than that.
Certainly.
Okay, so the second question here: Kangen machine makes well water more alkaline. Is it better for drinking water? I assume that depends on what the drinking water starts at. I mean, if it's already at 8, you don't want to make it more alkaline. But I just Googled that, and what is Kangen water? And it's basically it says if they filter your tap water, they also produce ionized alkaline and acidic waters through electrolysis. And it says they can be used for various purposes. So, yeah, I've never heard of one. But Dan, if it's...
I don't know really either. Some of those things, yeah, I don't know. I don't really want to say.
We'll have to look into it. But
you may not need some of those things.
Right. And it depends, there's various ways, like if your pH is low and you want to make it more alkaline, there's a lot of traditional treatment to do that. And this machine, which looks to be very expensive for one thing, just maybe a better mousetrap, if you will, on a typical, again, Dan's probably right. I should say too much until I look into it, but,
well, I didn't want to be critical or praising of it because I just didn't know for sure, and I know that there's a lot of explanations I see out there that doesn't seem like it would be something that I would be worrying about.
No, and that's an unusual, yeah. So, and certainly in some areas where they have very low pH, people are adding treatment to increase, to raise the pH. But whether this machine, I don't know that it makes anything better. And, it's just got a fancy name for electrolysis is what it looks like to me. But, if you'll send us an email, I'll look into that and we'll get back to you. But I personally, I'm a civil engineer, not a drinking water treatment specialist per se. So I need to investigate it. Not, yeah, I can't answer that off the top of my head. How to solve problem for surface contamination? Well, that's a very broad statement or question. If you're in an area where there's surface contamination already, you know, yeah, I guess I don't even, I need more specifics as far as if you could go to the question box and give us more information. You know, are you near a Superfund site? Are you near a place where there used to be a gas station? Are you talking about in general that there's stuff getting in your well, you know, from, are you in a rural area? Yeah, I'm not sure what the context is, and I apologize.
Hey, Steve, I have a sort of a related question that might, mostly if a well does have a problem, say a crack at the top part of the casing, is that something that a well driller can come out and fix by, I guess, digging it out and putting a new portion in? You know, if it were some kind of a... Oh.
Yeah, or, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, especially, you know, if it's right near the surface, they can dig that out and replace the piece of pipe, or they might be able to put a liner in and seal it so that it, you know, seals off that piece that's cracked or broken. You know, or if it's in a pit, what we recommend is, you know, raising that casing up, adding a piece of pipe, and then filling all that in below it. So yeah, really, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done. You know, we had wells that have been hit by a vehicle or a tractor or whatever, and it's cracked the casing at 3 or 4 feet, and, you know, they just come out and get a backhoe and dig out around it and cut off the pipe and replace it and seal it. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. Yep.
Okay. So the next thing says, question for Steve. What is your stance on the dry-driven grout method being used for new wells? I'm not sure what the dry-driven grout method is, to be honest. What I do know about liquid grout is, you know, Nebraska did a large study, the Department of Health and Human Services, about 10 or 12 years ago, and they showed in certain geologies that the grout that you're putting in along the well case, or, you know, on the outside in the annulus, after you've installed the well, doesn't necessarily stay in place. So the grout isn't doing the job it's meant to do, which is to be a clay protection around your well in the borehole so that material can't go from the surface along the outside of your well casing. Their recommendation is to use bentonite chips, natural chips, if you can, in a well. Yeah, I'm not seeing that done, so I'm not sure. I know I install monitoring wells, 2-inch PVC monitoring wells, so that we can measure water levels and water quality in some of the aquifers in Illinois, and I've always used bentonite chips, but we have the luxury of drilling an 8-inch hole or a 6-inch hole and putting in just a 2-inch PVC, so we have a lot of room in the annulus to make sure that we're filling in and getting a good clay seal between units, aquifer units and things like that. And so when you're drilling a home well, a lot of times you're putting a 5, sometimes 4, 5 or 6-inch casing, and it might be a 7 or 8-inch hole, and there's a lot less room in there, and so they're trimming and grout with a half-inch piece of PVC tubing. So you know, again, I'll have to look into that. I don't drill enough wells, and I haven't for years, to really be knowledgeable, but I do know enough drillers that I could ask that question for, and make sure that we get it answered correctly. So, okay. And that's all the questions we have. So there's a comment Alaska now has private well construction best management practices, still not a code, but developed by a stakeholder work group consisting of agencies, well contractors, private citizens, and that can be found at this URL. Yeah, and I wasn't trying to slight Alaska. Matter of fact, we have a number of folks from Alaska who participated in our webinars and who email us fairly regularly that are kind of out and they're on their own. And we've even had one well owner in Alaska who wrote a letter of reference for us because there's a lot going on in Alaska as far as what's mentioned here. And it's clear the state agencies and other concerned citizens and groups have really stepped up, and they're trying to at least provide better materials. And it's interesting also in Pennsylvania, where they can't pass a law that regulates drillers or well construction code. A lot of local groups have grown up out of that. And even some of the counties in Pennsylvania have passed laws that say to drill a well in our county, you have to have become a master driller through the National Groundwater Association's Master Driller Program to be able to drill a well there. So they've went around the state not having a law by creating their own way of ensuring that at least the drillers have some wherewithal to do the job right. So, and that's what you expect to happen. If the state government won't take care of it the way it really should be to protect, the individual's rights or, the ability to have a safe drinking water supply, it's great to see things like this happening. So, yeah. All right, I think that's all we have today. It is 2:30, a little after my time. So thanks again. And if you have more questions, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org, as I mentioned. We have a phone number on there as well, or you can always email me directly too. So yeah, appreciate everyone's time, and I guess that's the end of our webinar. So thank you.